Power that hides behind numbers doesn't look powerful at first glance. It looks ordinary. It looks like a group standing too close together, laughing a little too loudly, feeding off each other's confidence. Alone, none of them would have dared to do what they did. Each person knew that. That's why they stayed packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the weight of the decision so no single person had to carry it. This kind of power depends on diffusion. Responsibility spread thin enough that everyone can pretend it isn't theirs. If something goes wrong, blame becomes fog. No clear face. No clear hand. Just a crowd. People tell themselves that crowds can't be guilty, that only individuals can be. It's an easy lie, and it works frighteningly well. They believe the group made them untouchable. More voices meant less fear. More bodies meant less consequence. When someone hesitated, another stepped forward. When doubt surfaced, laughter crushed it. Numbers have a way of silencing conscience because no one wants to be the weak link, the one who breaks formation. Standing apart feels dangerous. Going along feels safe. This is how ordinary people cross lines they swore they never would. Not with a plan, not with malice they recognize, but with small justifications stacked on top of each other. Someone else started it. Someone else agreed. Someone else will stop it if it's wrong. And when no one does, the moment passes, and suddenly the line is far behind them. Groups like this don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as protected. They talk in shared language, inside jokes, coded looks. They reinforce each other's certainty. Any outside voice becomes an enemy, any objection an attack. The group becomes a shield, and behind that shield, cruelty feels permitted. What makes this kind of power so dangerous is how quiet it feels to the people inside it. There's no internal alarm, no sudden jolt of fear, just momentum, just movement, just the sense that this is how things go when you're not alone, when you have backup, when you believe the risk is spread thin enough to disappear. They didn't push her as individuals. They pushed her as a unit. That distinction mattered to them. It allowed each person to step back mentally, to tell themselves they weren't the one who did it. The group did it. The moment did it. Circumstances did it. Anything but them. Numbers also create illusion. The illusion that being many means being right. That consensus equals morality. That if enough people agree, the action must be justified. History shows how false that belief is, but in the moment, it feels solid. It feels proven. It feels like truth. This kind of power thrives on witnesses who don't interfere, on people who see the group and decide it's safer not to engage. Silence becomes reinforcement. Distance becomes permission. The group reads that silence as approval, even if it's really fear or shock. Every second without resistance strengthens their confidence. They mistook size for strength. They mistook noise for authority. They mistook unity for righteousness. And because they had never been challenged, they assumed they never would be. That assumption hardened into certainty. Certainty hardened into arrogance. But power built this way is fragile. It depends entirely on the group staying intact. One crack, one voice refusing to play along, one person who doesn't recognize their authority, and the illusion starts to wobble. The confidence they borrow from each other has no foundation of its own. That's why they never look behind them. Why would they? In their minds, nothing existed outside the circle they formed. They were focused inward, reinforcing themselves, feeding on the belief that together they were unstoppable, that numbers were armor, that accountability could be outpaced by momentum. They didn't realize that real power doesn't need a crowd to feel brave, and it doesn't need shared guilt to feel safe. Silence is rarely neutral, even though it pretends to be. It shows up as stillness, as hesitation, as people looking away and telling themselves it's not their place. In moments like this, silence feels small and harmless, almost invisible. But to the people exerting power, silence is loud. It sounds like agreement. It sounds like approval. It sounds like permission. No one said stop. No one stepped forward. No one broke the rhythm of what was happening. That absence mattered more than any shouted encouragement ever could. When a crowd watches and says nothing, it creates space for behavior to continue unchecked. It sends a message without words. Keep going, no one will interfere. Silence gives cover. It allows people to blend into the background and avoid responsibility while still benefiting from the outcome. They can later claim they weren't involved, that they didn't participate, that they were just there. But being there, witnessing without resistance, becomes its own form of participation. It feeds the moment instead of interrupting it. People stay silent for many reasons. Fear is one of them. Fear of becoming the next target. Fear of standing alone. Fear of misreading the situation. That fear doesn't make silence harmless. It just explains it. The impact remains the same. Silence removes friction, and without friction, harmful actions move faster. There's also the belief that someone else will speak up. That surely, out of all these people, one person will intervene. This belief spreads responsibility so thin it evaporates. Everyone waits. No one acts. The silence stretches, and with each passing second, it becomes harder to break. Speaking up late feels riskier than speaking up early. Silence can also come from uncertainty. People hesitate because they're not sure what they're seeing, not sure if it's serious enough, not sure if they have all the facts. That doubt paralyzes. Meanwhile, the situation doesn't pause to wait for clarity. It keeps moving forward, fueled by inaction. To those in control, silence feels like confirmation. It reassures them that their behavior is acceptable, or at least tolerable. If it were truly wrong, someone would say something. If it crossed a line, someone would stop it. That logic is flawed, but it's convincing in the moment, especially when surrounded by quiet faces and lowered eyes. Silence also protects self-image. Speaking up forces a person to choose a side, and that choice can disrupt how they see themselves. It can expose cowardice or demand courage. Staying silent allows people to tell themselves they're good without having to prove it. It's a way of preserving comfort at the cost of someone else's safety. The longer silence holds, the more it shapes the narrative. What starts as shocking becomes normalized. What once would have drawn gasps becomes background noise. The absence of reaction dulls the sense of urgency. The extraordinary starts to feel ordinary, and that shift is dangerous. Silence doesn't just affect the aggressors. It isolates the victim. It tells them they are alone, that no one is willing to stand with them. That message cuts deep. It can break resolve faster than any physical force. When no one speaks, the victim is forced to carry not just fear, but abandonment. And silence travels. It spreads from person to person, each one taking cues from the others. No one wants to be the first to break it, because breaking silence draws attention. It creates risk. It demands accountability. Remaining quiet feels safer, even when it isn't. There is a difference between not knowing what to say and choosing not to say anything. In moments of injustice, perfect words aren't required. Any disruption can shift momentum. A single voice can change the dynamic. Silence ensures the dynamic stays exactly as it is. Silence teaches the wrong lesson. It teaches that power goes unchallenged. That harm can happen in plain sight. That fear is more contagious than courage. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't stay confined to one moment. It follows people into the next situation and the next, reinforcing itself each time no one speaks. There is always a moment when everything changes, even if it looks small from the outside. It doesn't arrive with warnings or countdowns. It slips in quietly, disguised as just another step, just another decision. But once it happens, there is no returning to what things were before. Up until that point, people tell themselves they're still in control, that nothing irreversible has happened yet. They frame each action as temporary, adjustable, something they can undo if they need to. The line exists, but it's blurry, flexible enough to ignore. They convince themselves they haven't crossed it, only approached it. The moment the line is crossed, the story locks into place. Possibility narrows. Consequences wake up. What was once hypothetical becomes real. There's no more pretending this is harmless, no more claiming it's just talk or posturing. The situation demands to be seen for what it is. What makes this moment so dangerous is how quickly it passes. 1 second before, people still believe they can stop. 1 second after, stopping would require admitting what they've done. That admission is harder than continuing forward. So they keep going, driven not by intention, but by refusal to face the truth. This is where panic often hides behind confidence. Once the line is crossed, Bravado becomes armor. Voices get louder. Movements get sharper. Anyone watching closely can feel the shift. The energy changes. What was playful or aggressive turns desperate. They're no longer trying to dominate. They're trying to outrun responsibility. Crossing the line also changes how people see each other. Trust inside the group becomes conditional. Everyone is aware, even if they don't say it, that they're now bound together by the same act. No one can step away cleanly. No one can claim innocence without exposing the rest. That shared guilt becomes glue. The moment itself is often irreversible because it involves another person's safety, dignity, or life. Once that's put at risk, no apology can rewind time. No explanation can restore what was lost in that instant. The weight of that realization presses down, even if it's buried under denial. People on the outside feel it too. Witnesses sense when a situation tips from threatening to catastrophic. The air tightens. Breathing feels different. Instincts start screaming that this isn't a performance anymore. It's real. And that realization comes with fear, because now intervention carries higher stakes. Those who cross the line often underestimate how visible the shift is. They think they're still hiding behind ambiguity. They're not. The moment draws a sharp outline around their actions. Intent becomes clear. Excuses weaken. What was once debatable becomes undeniable. There's also a psychological point of no return. After crossing the line, self-image fractures. People must either accept that they've done something wrong or reshape their identity to justify it. Many choose the second option. They rewrite the story in their heads, casting themselves as provoked, misunderstood, forced into action. This is why escalation happens so fast after the line is crossed. Each new action serves to justify the previous one. Stopping would mean facing the original choice, and that feels unbearable. Momentum replaces thought. Movement replaces reflection. The line isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a word spoken too far, a hand placed where it shouldn't be, a step taken when someone is already cornered. The simplicity of the action doesn't lessen its impact. In fact, it often makes it harder to accept, because something so small shouldn't carry such weight. People who understand this moment know how fragile it is. They know that just before the line, intervention can still reset the situation. Just after, everything becomes harder. Risk multiplies. Emotions spike. Control slips. Those who cross the line often believe they've won something in that instant. Control. Dominance. Finality. What they don't realize is that the line marks the beginning of loss. Loss of moral ground. Loss of narrative control. Loss of safety they thought they had. From that moment on, the situation no longer belongs to them alone. It belongs to consequences, to witnesses, to anyone willing to step in, to forces they can no longer predict or manage, to reactions that don't need their permission, to outcomes that don't care about their intentions or excuses. Loud intimidation likes to announce itself. It fills space with noise, posture, exaggerated confidence. It wants to be seen and heard because it depends on reaction. The volume isn't strength. It's a signal flare meant to distract from what's underneath. Insecurity, fear, the need to dominate before being challenged. People who rely on intimidation believe control comes from making others uncomfortable. They invade space. They raise their voices. They use numbers, threats, and spectacle to overwhelm resistance before it forms. If everyone feels off balance, no one has time to question authority. That's the theory, at least. Real strength moves differently. It doesn't rush to fill silence. It doesn't need an audience to validate it. It's measured, deliberate, and often quiet enough to be mistaken for absence. That mistake is common. People conditioned to equate noise with power overlook the presence of someone who doesn't perform it. Loud intimidation feeds on response. A flinch, a step back, a lowered gaze. Each reaction reinforces the belief that it's working. That belief becomes addictive. The louder they get, the more they feel in control. But remove the response, and the tactic weakens. Silence from a different place. Stillness without fear. Real strength doesn't escalate when challenged. It stabilizes. It holds position without needing to prove anything. There's no urgency to dominate the room, because control doesn't come from volume. It comes from clarity, from knowing exactly where the line is and being willing to hold it. Intimidation is reactive. It spikes when it senses doubt. When someone doesn't submit, the noise increases. Threats sharpen. Posture stiffens. It's a performance designed to force compliance before confidence collapses. Real strength doesn't react that way. It observes first. It chooses its moment. People who mistake intimidation for strength often believe fear equals respect. They don't understand that fear is unstable. It turns quickly. It erodes loyalty. The moment fear stops working, there's nothing underneath it to hold authority in place. Real strength earns attention without demanding it. It shifts the atmosphere without changing volume. People notice it because it changes how the room feels. Breathing slows. Focus narrows. The chaos loses momentum. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface, but underneath, everything recalibrates. Intimidation relies on unpredictability to keep others off balance. Sudden movements, sharp words, unclear limits. Real strength is predictable in the best way. Its boundaries are clear. Its responses are consistent. That consistency creates pressure of a different kind. You know exactly what will happen if you cross the line. Those who intimidate often confuse restraint for weakness. They assume silence means hesitation. Stillness means fear. They mistake patience for passivity. That miscalculation is common, and it's costly. Real strength doesn't announce itself early because it doesn't need to. It waits until action matters. When intimidation meets real strength, the contrast is immediate. Noise meets calm. Chaos meets control. The intimidation suddenly feels exposed, almost embarrassing. Without fear to feed on, it starts to shrink. The performance loses its audience. Real strength also carries responsibility. It doesn't act for ego or reaction. It intervenes because it has to, not because it wants to be seen. There's no thrill in it. No rush. Just necessity. That's why it's so effective. It's not distracted by outcome or applause. Intimidation wants submission. Strength wants resolution. One escalates conflict. The other ends it. One leaves damage behind. The other restores order. The difference isn't in physical size or volume. It's in intent and control. People who have faced real danger understand this difference instinctively. They know that shouting is often a sign of lost control. That true authority can speak softly and still be obeyed. That presence outweighs performance every time. Loud intimidation burns fast. It exhausts itself. It requires constant effort to maintain. Real strength conserves energy. It waits. It chooses. It steps in only when necessary. And when it does, it doesn't need to raise its voice to be understood. One voice is all it takes to interrupt momentum. Not a speech. Not a crowd. Just a single person deciding that silence isn't an option anymore. When everything is moving in one direction, one voice changes the math. It introduces friction. It forces attention. It breaks the spell. Groups rely on flow. As long as things keep moving, no one has to think too hard. The moment someone speaks up, that flow stutters. Eyes shift. Bodies hesitate. The certainty that carried everyone forward suddenly has to answer a question it wasn't prepared for. That's why the first voice matters more than the loudest one. It doesn't have to dominate. It just has to exist. Once it does, the situation is no longer unanimous. And unanimity is where unchecked power feels safest. People underestimate how disruptive a single voice can be because they imagine it needs to overpower everything else. It doesn't. It only needs to be clear, calm, unwilling to play along. That refusal alone forces everyone else to recalculate their position. The first voice carries risk. It always does. Speaking up draws attention. It makes you visible. It separates you from the group. That's why so many people wait for someone else to go first. But once that first voice cuts through, the risk redistributes. Others suddenly have an opening. One voice also reframes the moment. It names what's happening. It pulls the situation out of ambiguity. Things that felt messy and unclear snap into focus. Once something is named, it can't hide behind confusion anymore. The power of that voice isn't in volume. It's in timing. Too early, and it's ignored. Too late, and the damage is already done. But at the right moment, it lands with weight. It forces a pause, and in that pause, everything becomes possible again. People often think authority gives a voice its power. Titles, status, rank. Sometimes that helps, but it's not required. Conviction carries its own authority. When someone speaks without fear or apology, it registers. Even those who disagree feel it. A single voice also gives witnesses permission to stop being silent. It breaks the isolation. It tells others they're not alone in what they're seeing or feeling. That shift is subtle but immediate. Shoulders relax. Postures change. The invisible pressure lifts just enough for movement. The people who are confronted by that voice feel it too. Their confidence falters, not because they've been defeated, but because they've been challenged. For the first time, their behavior isn't going unchecked. They're being seen clearly. That moment is uncomfortable. It strips away excuses. It forces awareness. Even if they don't back down immediately, something has changed. They know they're no longer operating in silence. Someone is paying attention. Someone is willing to intervene. One voice can stop everything because it introduces consequence. Not punishment. Consequence. The realization that actions are no longer contained. That they're being witnessed, remembered, possibly answered for. That awareness alone can halt momentum. There's also something grounding about a single voice in chaos. It provides a point of focus, a reference point. When everything feels unstable, clarity is magnetic. People instinctively orient toward it. The voice doesn't need to explain itself fully. It doesn't need to convince everyone. It just needs to draw a line and stand there. That line becomes an anchor. Others measure themselves against it, consciously or not. Many moments that could have ended differently didn't, because no one spoke first. Not because everyone agreed with what was happening, but because no one wanted to be alone. One voice changes that equation. It proves that being alone is temporary. The voice that stops everything is rarely emotional. It's steady, controlled. It doesn't beg. It doesn't threaten. It states reality and refuses to move away from it. That steadiness is what makes it effective. Once that voice exists, the situation can no longer pretend it's uncontested. The spell of inevitability breaks. The future opens up again, not because the danger is gone, but because the direction is no longer fixed. Accountability arrives when fear stops working. As long as fear controls the room, behavior goes unchecked. People comply, look away, fall in line. But fear is a temporary tool. It wears down. It slips. And the moment it does, the balance shifts. Those who rely on fear believe it's permanent. They mistake silence for obedience and stillness for agreement. They assume that because no one challenges them, no one will. That assumption is fragile. It depends entirely on everyone staying afraid forever, and that never lasts. Fear controls behavior, not belief. People may comply outwardly while internally counting exits, waiting for a signal, watching for a shift. The control looks solid, but underneath it's unstable. It requires constant pressure to maintain. The moment that pressure eases, cracks appear. Accountability doesn't usually show up dramatically. It doesn't storm in. It surfaces quietly, often right after fear loses its edge. When someone stops flinching. When a voice doesn't shake. When an action doesn't get the reaction it was meant to provoke. That's when fear realizes it's losing leverage. Once fear fails, authority is exposed. Not challenged yet, just visible. People begin to reassess. They notice inconsistencies. They recognize bluff. The illusion of control starts to dissolve, and with it, the protection fear once provided. Accountability thrives in clarity. Fear thrives in confusion. When fear can no longer cloud judgment, people start seeing actions as they are, not as they were framed. Threats sound hollow. Posturing looks desperate. Behavior that once felt untouchable suddenly looks reckless. This is the moment when consequences become real. Not imagined. Not abstract. Real consequences tied to names, faces, and actions. The shield that fear created no longer holds. There's no crowd to hide behind. No silence to absorb blame. Those who used fear often panic when they feel control slipping. They escalate, trying to regain dominance. Louder voices. Sharper threats. But escalation only accelerates accountability once fear has lost its grip. It draws attention. It leaves evidence. It narrows escape routes. Accountability doesn't require revenge. It doesn't need anger. It just needs awareness and willingness. Willingness to say this happened. Willingness to name who did what. Willingness to refuse the old rules that protected harm. When fear collapses, people remember what they know is right. Values resurface. Lines reappear. Things that were suppressed for safety return with force. That return can feel sudden, but it's been waiting all along. Those facing accountability often claim surprise. They act shocked that actions have consequences. In reality, they relied on fear to delay the inevitable. Fear didn't erase accountability. It only postponed it. There's a reason accountability feels heavier after fear fades. Without fear, there are no excuses left. No coercion to hide behind. No pressure to blame. What remains is choice. And choice carries weight. Witnesses also change when fear loosens its hold. People who stayed silent start speaking. Memories sharpen. Details surface. Stories align. What was once fragmented by intimidation begins to form a clear picture. Accountability also restores balance. It reminds everyone that no one operates outside consequence indefinitely. That power without restraint isn't power at all. That control taken through fear is borrowed time. This shift doesn't always end in justice immediately. Sometimes it starts with discomfort, with exposure, with the loss of respect or legitimacy. But that loss matters. It changes how future actions are received. It limits how far fear can be used again. Those who understand this don't rush accountability. They let fear collapse under its own weakness. They wait until control is gone, until reactions are honest, until the truth no longer has to fight intimidation to be heard. When fear loses control, accountability doesn't need force. It arrives naturally, carried by clarity, by witnesses no longer looking away, by people willing to stand without shrinking, by actions that can no longer hide in noise or silence, by the simple fact that once fear stops working, everything that was done in its name becomes visible.